Yes.
Okay. So today I'm going to tell you something about this paper called Lexical Alternatives Improve 5-year-olds' Ability to Compute Scalar Implicatures. And it was written by Skordos and Papafragou in the year 2012. And I'm going to start with a short introduction and introduce the main topic and the research questions. So the paper basically is about the question, how do children pair with scalar implicatures and how do they generate them? And Gualmini and others stated in a study from 2001 that children's problem in generating scalar implicatures often lies within generating scalar alternatives when they are faced with a weak scalar term. And based on this, we could ask ourselves the question, can the mere mention of a stronger scalar alternative, like all, encourage the participant to generate a scalar implicature from the use of a weak alternative? And based on these points, Skordos and Papafragou, they stated a hypothesis, which said that implicit lexical contrast between strong and weak scalar terms makes the alternatives more accessible, and it also helps to facilitate the scalar implicature generation. So yeah, this might sound a little bit complicated now, but I think you will understand it when we move on with the experiment. So for the experiment, there were 61 5-year-old children and 36 adult participants. And for the experiments, there were PowerPoint slides shown with creatures called blickets. And you can see 4 of those slides on the right-hand side. And yeah, there were 4 types of trials, which were repeated 4 times with different items. So in total, we had 16 PowerPoint slides. And this experiment was an acceptability judgment task. So there was a puppet. In this case, it was called Max the Silly Gorilla. And the puppet described the slides to the participants. So it said a sentence, and the participants had to decide whether the statement from the puppet was true or false. And in case they rejected the puppet statement, then they had to give an explanation on why they rejected it. And yeah, let's have a closer look at the 4 types of trials. So the first type was the true-all trial, which you can see in the first slide. So the true-all trials, in this case, 4 out of the 4 blickets had the item, and the puppet said in the statements, all of the blickets have a crayon in this case. Then for the false-all trial, only 3 out of 4 blickets had the item, and the puppet said again the sentence, all of the blickets have a crayon, or the requested item. And yeah, these were the all trials. And for the sum trials, we had a felicitous sum and an infelicitous sum trial. And for the felicitous sum trial, 3 out of 4 blickets had the item, and the puppet said the sentence, some of the blickets have this item. And then for the infelicitous sum trial, as you can see on the last slide, 4 out of the 4 blickets had the item, and the puppet again said the sentence that some of the blickets have this item. And yeah, so the first 3 trials, they were based more on the semantic judgment, and for the last trial, the infelicitous sum trial, there you can test the pragmatic judgment and the ability to generate scalar implicatures. And yeah, each trial was repeated 4 times with different items. And yes, so apart from the trials, there were also preconditions, between subject conditions. So there was a mixed condition, and in this condition, some and all statements were intermixed in a random order, so that a lexical contrast between stronger and weaker scalar terms could be established. Then there was a sum first condition, and in this condition the sum and all statements were blocked, and the sum block always came before the all block. But within these two blocks, the order of the statement was random. And then, yeah, the third condition was the infelicitous sum first condition. And in this block, like in the previous one, the trials were split into blocks. So there was a sum block and the all block. But the difference now is that in the sum block, the infelicitous sum trial always came before the felicitous sum trial. So I hope this is clear. And yes, so there were 36 adults, and they were evenly distributed between the three conditions. So there were 12 for the mixed condition, 12 for the sum first, and 12 for the infelicitous sum first condition. And as for the children, who were 61, there were 21 assigned to the mixed condition and 20 to the sum first and to the infelicitous sum first condition. Okay, so let's move on with the predictions. So we heard earlier that if lexical contrast between stronger and weaker scalar terms can make the alternatives more accessible, then the rejection of the infelicitous sum statements will improve when a contrast between strong and weak scalar alternatives, so between all and sum, is available. And this contrast is available in the mixed condition, because as we remember, in the mixed condition, the sum and all statements were intermixed, but in no specific order. And yeah, this was a prediction that was made for the children regarding the infelicitous sum statement. Regarding the other statement, they made no predictions, I think, and also for the adults, they didn't predict anything. Yeah. So let's move on with the coding. So the participants had to answer yes or no to the puppet statement, and yes was coded as the correct answer in case of the true all and of the felicitous sum trial. So here you can see them again. And no was coded the correct answer in case of the false all and the infelicitous sum trial. And for each participant, there was a number of correct answers calculated for each trial and for each participant. And if that number was 0.75 or greater, then the participant would be considered a passer. And if it was 0.5 or less, then the participant would be considered a failure. So let's have a look at the results. So first, we have a look at the adult performance. So can you see this, or is there?
Yep.
Okay, because for me there is the Zoom picture in the table. Okay, so yeah, as you can see, the adults, they performed pretty great for all conditions. So for the mixed condition, there were only passers, and also for the sum first condition. But yeah, only for the infelicitous sum first condition, in the infelicitous sum trial, there were 10 passers and 2 failures. But overall, they did a pretty good job. So let's look at the children's results, which are more interesting. Yeah, so we can start with the true all trial. So for the true all trial, you see that in each condition, the children were really good. And also for the false all trial and the felicitous sum trial, you can see that the results were rather the same. And so we can only see a big difference in the infelicitous sum trial, where you can see that for the mixed condition, there were 19 passers and 2 failures. Then for the sum first condition, there were 11 passers and 9 failures. So yeah, basically an even number of passer and failures. And then for the infelicitous sum first condition, there are 16 failures, but only 4 passers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask you one thing?
Yeah.
Just to remind me. So the difference between the mixed and the sum first condition is that in the sum first, they didn't see the whole trial, right?
In the sum first, the sum trials always came before the all trials.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the infelicitous sum, the infelicitous sum trials came first. And in the mixed, the all trials came before the sum trials?
No, I think it was like really random. So it could be that there was a sum trial before an all trial, but like they weren't blocked, and so the order was random. Yeah.
All right. So they would see already in the first block all the kind of trials, basically. Is that how?
I'm not sure actually. I don't want to say something false, but yeah, I understood that they saw the trials after each other, but in the mixed condition, it could be that they saw an all trial, then a sum trial, then a false all trial, and then yeah, so it was like really random. I understood it that way. Yeah.
Right. So they probably were exposed more at the all trials compared to the sum first condition, right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And
you should check it out. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and as we can see, there are also children who didn't perform that well on the other trials. So on the true all, false all, and felicitous sum trials, there are also some failures. And so they made a second experiment where they excluded the children who had less than 0.75 on the true all, false all, or felicitous sum trial. So they excluded all the failures. And yeah, then they made a second analysis, and here are the results for the second analysis, but only regarding the infelicitous sum trial, so the trial that gives us information about the ability to generate scalar implicatures. And you can see there are, for the mixed condition, 14 passers and 0 failures. For the sum first condition, 9 passers and 4 failures. And for the infelicitous sum first condition, the results were again the worst, because there were only 4 passes and 7 failures. And so that, yeah, we can say that even if we look at children in this experiment who we assume have the correct semantic knowledge, because they proved it in the previous experiment, the results were not that different from the first experiment. And yeah, so we're gonna see what that means. And yeah, so in the beginning, we said that children's problem in generating scalar implicatures often lie within generating scalar alternatives when they are faced with a weak scalar term. And our hypothesis was that implicit lexical contrast between strong and weak scalar terms makes these alternatives more accessible, and therefore also helps to facilitate the scalar implicature generation. So this implicit lexical contrast is given in the mixed condition, and we can see that the results for the infelicitous sum trial were in the experiment number 1 and 2 were always the best results in the mixed condition. So this was the condition where the children rejected the infelicitous sum statement the most. And we can also see that when the lexical contrast was eliminated, so in the sum first and in the infelicitous sum first condition, the children's performance also fell. So the rejection of the infelicitous sum statements weren't as good as in the mixed condition. Yeah, and I think that concludes my presentation. So I hope that everything was clear. And if you have questions, please ask.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It was very clear. So one thing that I was wondering also about the experiment we presented last time is like, why did they use this word blicket and not like a normal a normal object? Why did they mention why they decided to use a pseudo word instead of a real word?
I don't remember if they mentioned it. Yeah. I just remember that they said these are blickets and these are the only blickets that exist in the world. Yeah. But I don't know why they used blickets and not like other.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason was that they did not want the knowledge of the participants to have an effect on the rate of scalar implicature, right? So they said, if you use pizzas or cookies, right, then children might actually sort of use their knowledge in order to answer the question, and then So Mike is also saying yes, so probably.
I think so, because if you said, for example, that there are also, if you take cats and then you say the cats have a crayon, then maybe children will say that's not possible. How are cats able to use a crayon?
So I'm just reading the paper again. So they say that so in the mixed condition, like you said, they put the sum and all statements in a pseudo random order, so then the lexical contrast was clearer, right? And in the sum first condition, they presented sum and all in blocks with the sum before always, right?
Yeah.
So that the stronger alternative was eliminated, they say. So meaning that they didn't see it, basically, right? Yeah. And in the infelicitous sum, the same thing, but the first condition was always the infelicitous one. And then they say that they have a further split into two blocks where the infelicitous were always before the felicitous trials, okay? So in the sum first, it could be that you would see either the felicitous or the infelicitous, right? Whereas in the infelicitous sums, you really always saw the infelicitous sum first. And it's interesting that was the worst performance, right? So this really suggests that if they see the all alternative first, then their improvement, then their performance with scalar implicatures is going to be improved, right? So I guess their conclusion was that it was really the lexical contrast between all and some that made the implicature stronger, right?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So so just to summarize a little bit, these experiments sort of show that these phenomena, these pragmatic phenomena like scalar implicature, are very sensitive to the saliency of the alternatives. So that really suggests that in order to derive a sum but not all inference, it is very important to access the scale. So the scale formed by the two elements, the weaker element and the stronger element. Especially the strong element must be salient. So if you see sum in a sentence, in order to derive the inference, it must be important the saliency of the stronger scalemate. And then if you have it overtly in a trial, then in a way it sort of make the prominence of the strong scalemate higher, and then you're going to get more implicatures. And this is also important if you want to sort of design experiment of scalar implicatures, that you have to bear in mind that if you want to cancel out this effect of sort of priming of the lexical scale, then you have to intermix and vary the order of the trials. Whereas if you want to prime implicatures, then you should present trials with the stronger alternative first, right? And this effect also has been found in other experiments, although with different quantifiers. So, for instance, I think no one is going to present this paper, but Foppolo et al. Found that in their experiment, it was actually the presence of none that made the implicature stronger rather than all. Okay, so there are also different findings with respect to this issue, and it definitely seems that priming the scale and priming both elements of the scale is going to make the scalar computation more robust. Okay, thank you very much. I guess we can go to the next presentation. So we have Paula and Caroline, right? Maybe Paula could go first.
Yes, it's no problem.
So that we can introduce a little bit the number issue. Yeah. So if you wanna.
How can I upload my presentation?
Yeah. So if you press, so if you have your presentation open on your computer and you press the button share screen, then should let you choose to share the screen of the presentation.
Okay, just a second. Can you see something?
Yes.
Okay, but I don't know how to, maybe quickly.
No, I guess you can do full screen. Yeah, thank you.
So, my presentation is about an article called Isomorphism for All but Not Both, Floating as a Means to Investigate Scope by Tieu. And as we already heard, the isomorphism effect is about scopally ambiguous sentences containing negation and floating quantifiers. And the goal of this experiment is a better understanding whether children and adults differ in their representations and processing of such ambiguities, because it was firstly claimed by other people that children prefer the isomorphic interpretation while adults prefer the non-isomorphic interpretation. And however, Tieu argues that children and adults are essentially alike in their interpretative preferences on condition that following factors are held constant. So first, the associated NP, then second, the syntactic position of the associated NP, and third, the context in which the test sentences are presented. And in the first experiment, Tieu used the floating quantifier all, which can appear in three positions, namely pre-nominally, post-nominally, but before negation, and in a position following negation. In the first experiment, participants were 38 English-speaking 4-year-old children and 42 adult native speakers of English. All participants were tested individually, and the participants' interpretation of negative test sentences containing the floating quantifier all were tested. So there was an experimenter who told the stories, and there was a puppet as well, and the participants were told that the puppet is not good at paying attention to stories, and the children were given a scorecard to fill out with the goal of helping the puppet to learn how to pay better attention. And at the end of each story, the puppet was asked a question by the experimenter. So like, parrot what happened in the story. And yeah, the participants' task was to determine whether the puppet statement was right or wrong. And if it was right, they put a stamp under the smiley face. And if it was false, they put a stamp under the sad face. And the test stories, they involved 3 characters. One character carried out an action, and the other 2 found a reason not to do so. And there was Jack climbing the tree, and John and Jim who didn't climb the tree. And the test sentences contained the floating quantifier all in one of these 3 possible positions. The sentence was false on the wide scope reading of all, so it was false that every character failed to carry out the action, as one of them did carry out the action. And true on the narrow scope reading. Not all of the characters carried out the action, as only one did. Yeah, so the participants were randomly assigned to one of these 3 conditions. And in the pre-nominal and the floated pre-negation conditions, so the first 2, a wide scope reading corresponded to an isomorphic interpretation, while in the third condition, it corresponded to a non-isomorphic interpretation. Yeah, the dependent measure in the analysis was the proportion of no responses, which corresponded to isomorphic readings in the pre-nominal and floated pre-negation conditions, and to non-isomorphic readings in the floated post-negation condition. Results had shown that participants gave more no responses in the first 2 conditions than in the third one. And to remember, the no responses corresponded with isomorphic readings in the pre-nominal and the floated pre-negation conditions, while yes responses corresponded to the isomorphic reading in the floated post-negation condition. And the experiment illustrated that while holding the factors I already mentioned constant, we find that both adults and children display a preference for the isomorphic reading. Yeah, so finding out that children did not differ from adults in their interpretation of floating quantifier all, this leads to the view that children and adults do not differ in their grammatical representation of such ambiguous sentences. Then there was a second experiment, so to investigate whether the finding for all could be generalized to other floating quantifiers. Tieu modified the first experiment using the floating quantifier both instead of all, and both can appear in the same 3 positions as before. There was one difference between the 2 quantifiers. Both triggers a presupposition on the cardinality of the quantified NP, so it requires exactly 2 members, and the numbers of characters were in each story reduced from 3 characters to 2 characters. So there was just one person climbing a tree and the other one didn't climb it. And there were 42 English-speaking children and 56 adult native speakers of English who took part in the experiment, and they were tested individually again. The procedure was the same as in the first one, and the participants listened to the stories and had to judge the puppet's description of the events by filling out a scorecard. Test stories and test sentences were parallel to those from the first one, and except that as I already mentioned, the stories involved 2 characters instead of 3, and so the plural subject, the boys, we had in the first experiment the subject, the boys, and this was changed to a conjunctive NP, Jack and Jill. And just in the case of all, the sentence was false on the wide scope reading of both, but true on the narrow scope reading. Wide scope reading again corresponded to an isomorphic interpretation in the pre-nominal and floated pre-negation conditions, but to a non-isomorphic interpretation in the floated post-negation conditions. Yeah, so to the results, the dependent measure in the second analysis was again the proportion of no responses, which corresponded to isomorphic readings in the pre-nominal and floated pre-negation conditions, and to non-isomorphic readings in the floated post-negation conditions. Participants gave again more no responses in the first and the second conditions than in the third one, but there were more no responses in the third condition for both than for the other quantifier all. And the proportions of no responses indicates that adults and children generally preferred isomorphic readings in the first and second conditions, but non-isomorphic readings in the floated post-negation condition. So the participants showed a preference for the wide scope reading of both in all three conditions. The first and the two experiment demonstrate that it is possible to hold factors constant while testing the comprehension of scopally ambiguous sentences. Additionally, Tieu showed that when these factors are held constant, 4-year-olds and adults display isomorphic preferences in their interpretation of ambiguous sentences containing the floating quantifier all. In the case of both, children and adults display a preference for isomorphism only when both precedes negation. And for both quantifiers, one can say that children and adults display the same interpretative preferences and therefore do not differ in their grammatical representations of such scopally ambiguous sentences. The finding of the second experiment reveals that the floating quantifiers are not all alike. And I mean, both quantifiers are floating ones, but it seems that they are still different in a way. And then Tieu thought that's maybe because of the conjunctive NP. So in the first experiment, we had the boys, and in the second, the conjunctive NP, Jack and Jill. And he thought that maybe the conjunctive NP might somehow bias the participants toward a wide scope reading of both. And so there was a third little experiment where Tieu replaced Jack and Jill with the boys again. So we had sentences like both the boys both, and the boys didn't both climb the tree. And the participants were not the same from the first and second experiment. However, the modification of the NPs didn't lead to other results. So adults and children still displayed an isomorphic preference only in the first and second condition. And yeah, so for the wide scope reading of both, it doesn't matter if NP is a definite plural or a conjunctive NP. And to sum up, it remains unclear what relevant difference between the two floating quantifiers might explain the difference in scope preferences. However, the crucial finding is that children were adult-like in their interpretative preferences in the cases of all and both. And this provides further evidence that children and adults do not differ in their grammatical representation of scopal ambiguous sentences. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope everything was clear. If not, please ask me. I will try to answer the questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It was very clear. It's like there's a lot of information in this experiment. So maybe we should go a little bit slowly through the results again, if you don't mind. So if
yeah,
you can,
it's okay.
If you can show the sentences for the first experiment, right?
Oh yeah, that's the first one.
Yes. So basically, what they do is to manipulate the overt syntactic position of this quantifier, right? So
yes.
All the boys didn't climb the tree, or the boys all didn't climb the tree, or the boys didn't all climb the tree, right? So one interesting difference between this experiment and the other experiments is that here they didn't change the grammatical role of the quantifier. So they didn't move the quantifier from subject to object, right? They just changed the position in the sentence of
the
all.
Surface order, yeah.
And yeah, so I just wanted to mention basically the numbers, right? So in the first two conditions, they got that both children and adults provided like more than 80% of no responses, right? So when they responded no, it means that they adopted a non-interpretation, right? A universal negative interpretation, correct?
Yeah.
Because the context was always where one boy, well, like some boys climbed the tree and some boys didn't, right?
Yeah.
So, right. So basically it's only in the third condition that they had not all, but some interpretation, basically, right? So it really matters that the position, the surface position of the quantifiers with respect to negation, right? Because the third position is the only one where all occurs after negation.
Yeah.
Right? Right. And the other nice thing that they show is that, look, adults and children actually gave exactly the same pattern of responses. So in the third condition, both gave less than 20% of no answers. So they almost all developed, like, showed a strong preference for what would be the isomorphic interpretation here, if you consider all taking scope, like taking narrower scope with respect to negation, right? So not all, but some. So yeah, so basically the rate of universal negative interpretation dropped from 80% in the first two conditions to 20%, right?
Yes.
And in the other experiment, if you can show the sentences.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So in this experiment, yeah, in the first two conditions, they gave a super high rate of no answer responses. So again, they interpreted both taking scope over negation, right? So both Jack and Jill didn't climb the tree, meaning that neither of them did. But then even in the third condition, right, Jack and Jill didn't both climb the tree. 60% of adults and 80% of children still provided no responses, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So they still preferred the
non-isomorphic.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we talk about the same like, you know, if we focus on the kind of interpretation, they still prefer the both not. So what would be a stronger negative interpretation, right? Regardless of the scope of the overt scope in the sentence. So what they find is that, again, children and adults behave the same, but both and all behave differently. Because in the first experiment, when all occurred after negation, that it yielded a different interpretation, whereas here, it doesn't really matter. I mean, they got a little bit of fewer no responses, right? But still more than half. And then finally, in their final control experiment, they found that changing from Jack and Jill to the boys again, right? It yielded a very, very low percentage of no answer in the third condition. So changing the structure of the subject from a conjunctive NP to a definite NP, it you know, again, it sort of gave an effect that then it became sensitive to overt scope. So the boys didn't both climb the tree. This time seemed to be interpret with the narrow scope of both compared to negation, right?
Yes.
So somehow changing and to the gave rise to a different profile of interpretation, which is very interesting, and also not as clear to explain unless you assume that both and all have different scope properties, right? I guess that's what you have to assume at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right? cool. So yeah, so very interesting. So yeah, to sum up again, we might say that different scope-bearing elements have different properties, right? And again, this is very important if you want to design experiments to take this into account. So, and not only different scope elements, but also the nature of your the syntactic or linguistic structure of your quantified NP as well matters for which kind of scope configuration you prefer at the end of the day, right? But I guess one of their biggest claim was that, you know, in spite of these differences between the structure of the subject and between the quantifiers that you're using, adults and children behave very, very similarly, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any comment, any question?
Yes, sorry, can I ask like a general question about these experiments?
Sure.
In this experiment, there were 42 children, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the one that I had, it was like 24. And I'm wondering if you have difference between, I don't know, 60 and 80%, if that is even that significant, because it's like 2 children, or, you know, how much do things have to differ for it to be significant if the number is so low, like in experimented children?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, right. So, you know, there is no clear answer to this, right? So, I guess you know, the more subjects you have, the more statistical power you have, and the more you can appreciate fine differences between your results. So, for instance, if we take the results, I can share my screen now. Yeah. Do you?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So you see, this was the result they had in the both experiment, right? Right. So what you are saying is that, look, here, for instance, we have I would say 18% difference, probably almost a 20% difference in response, right? Which is actually quite large. So usually when you find a 20% difference in an experiment, that turns out to be significant. But then it depends on how many children you have, right? So your sample size might affect your, you know, the conclusion and the conclusion you want to draw from your results. So what they found here, right? No effect of group, no general effect of group with the two-way ANOVA, a main effect of quantifier position, and no significant interaction, right? So what they're claiming is that there is no difference basically between the responses of the groups in this condition. So, right. So what you're saying is that, yeah, okay, you know, they're claiming there is no difference, but did they have enough participants to investigate these small differences, right? And yeah, so, you know, there is no clear answer to this. I mean, usually if you have like a number of like 40 children, that's actually quite a good number, right? It also depends on how many trials per condition you have. So here, how many trials do they have per condition?
4.
4, right. And did they see every condition? So they use a 2x3 design, quantifier position. So I guess yes, right?
No, it's between subjects.
Oh, it's between subjects. So these 42 children were were divided in the 3 conditions. Right. So you see, that's actually an interesting detail, because then it means that for every condition you didn't have more than 42 times 3, right? Is it? Which should be which should be 14 children per condition. Am I right? So 14 children per condition per 4 trials is like 48 data points per condition. And yeah, and that is not a lot, right? Right. So
like a general problem to find children to do those experiments, or is it just like easier to do it with less children?
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah, right. Ideally, the more subjects you have, the more statistical power you have. But I guess their point was that the results, in a way, were quite clear, that even if they had more children, they wouldn't have found a big difference, right? So they would say, even if these fine-grained difference were significant, the main trend is that children and adults kind of behave the same, right? But yeah, you are completely right. In fact, for instance, in our experiment, we had generally we have about 48 children who see every condition. So you see the difference in statistical power is basically 3 times in favor of my experiment. So because we also have 4 trials per condition, and then you can you can better investigate smaller effects. So maybe if they had 3 times more participants, they would have found an interaction between the floated pre-negation and the floated post-negation effect, right? So that's a very good comment. And yeah.
But also, can I just add something? So the problem with having more participants, because Danny said you have more statistical power, also means that you will much easier have like a significant test, right? Which is not always what you want, because at some point when you have a lot of participants or items, you will have a significant difference between conditions where there really isn't one, right? You see a very tiny, like in these bars, you see a very tiny difference numerically, but if you test too many participants, this will still be significant. So there is a balance to be held. So you can have too many participants if you do this kinds of stats.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, right? I mean, it's a matter of debate, right? So I mean, Mike is right in saying that if you have too much statistical power, then everything is going to turn out to be significant. But then, the problem is not, I don't think that the problem is in the measurement itself, but it's about interpreting the results you get, basically. So let's say that they got a difference, like an interaction between the floated pre-negation and the floated post-negation. How would you interpret that, right? So I guess, I don't know. What do you think?
Right, but that's sort of the point, right?
Yeah.
Like if you, the point is then what kinds of tests you do and how you report the results. So if you do it like most people and you just say, oh, it's significant, so that must tell me something, I have to interpret it, then I think it's probably easier to just have fewer participants. But if you put in a bit more work into interpreting the results by having whatever other numbers there, then you can test as many people as you want to, and you should. Then more participants are indeed better. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, if you look at the results, right here, you have a higher proportion of no responses for the adult group in the flooded pre-negation condition, right? So in the boys all didn't eat the cake. And then if you compare it to the other one, you have the same pattern. So then again, you have a higher percentage of no responses for the John and Bill both didn't blah 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 blah, right? So which is, yeah, so let's say that this turned out to be significant. So let's say that you had a difference between the pre-nominal and the flooded pre-negation condition, then how would you interpret that? One way would be to say that children in a way are more sensitive to this manipulation. So then when you flood a quantifier but still you keep it before negation, then the adults would be more isomorphic than children, right? And this would be something very difficult to interpret. But then again, I mean, in general, I agree with what Mike says, but it's not a good practice to have fewer participants because you don't want to have effects that you cannot interpret, right? So that's, in general, this is a problem about how you design your experiments and how you interpret your effects and what are the hypotheses you're testing. But as a general rule, the problem is never having too many participants. The problem is having too few participants, right? Because if too
too few items as well.
And too few items as well. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, these are all interesting comments. So one of the things where the number of participants and the items matters a lot is that if you want to replicate an experiment, right? Or if you want to have a strict comparison between two experiments, then ideally you should have a comparable number of participants and items, right? So that's actually quite important. So if, for instance, you cannot run an experiment where you have 12 participants per condition and then to change something and then to test something else and to compare it with the previous experiment, but then you have like 40 participants per condition, right? Because then the difference in the effect could be due to the difference in your statistical power and not really in the manipulation that you make. So, kind of holding the same structure and the same statistical power across different experiments is very important for cross comparison, right? But yeah, I mean, I would say that they have this kind of, I mean, there is a suspect of an interaction going here between the two flooded conditions in both experiments, right? So probably if they had run more participants, they would have found this effect significant, but we don't know. So, without knowing that, you cannot really draw any conclusion. Okay, so again, if we have a comparison between the previous presentation and this presentation, you see that these sentences that generate ambiguity at different levels. So for instance, at the level of pragmatic inference that you can derive from the sentence, or at the level of scope configuration that are present in the sentence. Generally when you interpret ambiguous sentences, a lot of factors might play a role. Okay, so the scope configuration of the sentence might play a role, but even the surface structure of the sentence, so whether you have a floating quantifier or not, plays a role. But even the mere presentation of different conditions, so for scalar implicatures, the presentation of the item containing the stronger alternative plays a role. Okay, so one of the million-dollar questions is whether, you know, when you want these possible confounds not to play a role, how do you balance these things out? And usually you just randomize the presentation of the items, right? But then you have to be careful of that, because then we have seen from the mixed condition that when you randomize items, you are actually introducing a sort of a structure in the item, right? So yeah, so these are all things that have to be considered and to be kept in mind. The opposite view is to say that there are some strong effects due to grammar and due to, for instance, the whether you have you know, whether you have universal quantifier taking scope or negation, or the other way around. And these are the strong effects. And then these effects can be masked by other factors, which you know, can add some sort of can switch the presentation of participants, even though they're not grammatical in nature, right? So for instance, the order of presentation of items, and then we see, you know, for instance, intonation profiles, or even the way your visual context is created, right? Okay, so I guess we could take like a 5 minutes break. And then in the second part of our today's meeting, we are gonna see a little bit on, yeah, so we are gonna change topic a little bit, and we are gonna talk specifically about numerals, okay? So we have seen numerals with respect to scope configuration, but we haven't specifically investigated the issue of how the meaning of numerals is derived. I mentioned that at the Blackboard the last time, but today we are going to see something about that specific topic and how they interact with implicatures, okay? So see you in 5 minutes, 7 minutes, like at 12:15.
Do you still see it? Yeah, okay.
Yes, very well.
So, all right, in today's presentation, I will talk about the paper, What Exactly Do Numbers Mean? By Huang, Spelke, and Snedeker. And Huang works at the Department of Hearing and Speech Sciences at the University of Maryland, and Spelke and Snedeker both work at the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. So, all right. What is this paper about? Apparently, there has been a disagreement on the interpretation of number words. So psychologists tend to say that numbers have exact semantics, while linguists say that numbers have lower bound semantics. I will talk about the meaning of these terms in a minute. However, Huang et al. Did some research to see what is really true now. For doing so, they studied both children that are still in the process of acquiring numbers and adults that already have semantic knowledge of numbers. And because it's important for the experiments later on, children acquire numbers sequentially. So meaning that at first they acquire the meaning of 1, but not 2. Then at the age of 2 to 3, they acquire the meaning of 2, but not 3, and so on and so forth. So the children that are of interest in our experiments are the so-called 2 knowers. So they know the meanings of 1 and 2, but not of the number 3. All right, so now what exactly are lower bound or exact semantics? So first of all, let's have a look at what lower bounded means. To do so, let's talk about scalar terms first. So you can say that scalar terms are upper and lower bound. So either they mean some but not all, or some and possibly all, or at least some. And we already heard about this in the last weeks. But now Horn stated that number words are interpreted parallel to scalar terms. So saying that 2 actually means at least 2. So if I say 2 dogs, it means at least 2 dogs. And Exact semantics means that numbers, unlike scalar terms, have an exact interpretation. So 2 means exactly 2, not more, not less. For this, I've got an example here, like everyone who ate some of their berries felt fine, which also means that everyone who ate all of their berries also felt fine. So we could say everyone who ate at least some and possibly all of their berries felt fine. But this doesn't really work for the next sentence, like everyone who ate 2 of their berries felt fine. I can't say everyone who ate 3 of their berries felt also fine, like the first sentence doesn't entail the second one. That's basically what exact semantic means. All right, so now to the interesting stuff. In total, there were 4 experiments made. All of them shared the same format, which we call the covered box task. It sounds more mystical than it is. So what does it mean? It's pretty simple. Like the participant is given 3 boxes, like 3 choices, with different contents. And 2 of those boxes are open, so you can see what's inside, and 1 is obviously covered. Then the participants are given the task to choose the correct box, and they can choose either one of the open ones or the covered one. The procedure is pretty easy as well. Like there are 2 to 3 phases. The pre-test phase tested whether the children were appropriate representators of the studies, for the studies. So they were tested on the knowledge of numbers and scalars. Then there was the familiarization phase. That was the same for both children and adults. So just for them to get to know the task and to also see if children were capable of picking the right box. In those phases, the participants were also allowed to take a look into the covered box and see if they chose the right one, if they chose the covered box. They were not allowed to look into the box, into the covered box during the test phase though, which is the phase that came afterwards to test what numbers actually mean. So what was inside these boxes? Speaking of experiments 1 and 2 now, there were 2 different tasks. Like the first task was to choose the box in which Cookie Monster had some of the cookies, which is here, like there in box 1, this is Big Bird and this is Cookie Monster. So just not to get you confused, because I was confused when reading this. So in this box, Cookie Monster had no cookies. Here he had 3 of 6 cookies, and this box was covered. And so on and so forth. And the second task was to choose the box in which were 2 fish. Yeah, you can see this here. And of course, the order was messed up during the test. So, all right, on to the results, the very interesting part. So there were the first 2 experiments. We will talk about experiment 1 first. There were 60 English-speaking adults tested. So the gray box here represents the scalar term, and the black box next to it represents the number term. So surprise, surprise, in figure A, we see that 100% of adults chose the box in which Cookie Monster had some of the cookies, and the box in which there were 2 fishes. And in figure B, you can see that adults chose like almost the same, like almost all of the adults chose the same box as before, like just those 10% chose the covered box when it came to some, but you can say that the overwhelming majority chose the same box, the visual sum and 2 choices. But what really is interesting is the test phase, like here in C. There you can see that 87% of adults chose the box in which Cookie Monster had all of the cookies and rarely selected the covered box here. but 100% of adults selected the cover box when there was no box available containing exactly 2 fish, which lets us conclude that adults reject semantically lower bound versions when it comes to number terms, which would indicate an exact interpretation of numbers. But let's go on to experiment number 2, where 20 English-speaking children of age 2 to 3, so-called 2 knowers, were tested. So you can see that figure A is pretty similar to figure A of the adults. Like almost no children chose other boxes than the right ones, I would say. Then there is some difference in figure B, which we will talk about a little bit later. And figure C shows almost the same result as the adult experiment as well. So here there is just an issue with figure B, where we could say that children are more likely to select the subset, like the sum term, when it was paired with a semantically incompatible set, like the empty set here. So they are more likely to select the sum set here. Then when it's paired with a semantically compatible set, the total set here. So here they were a bit indecisive. So what's the problem with that? We could say that children cancel out the scalar term and just choose a box where Cookie Monster has cookies at all. So for this, they made another experiment.
Sorry, can I ask you to go back to the pictures, because it's not easy for me to remember, you know, which results belong to which condition, right? Yeah. So the critical one here is the one in which you violate the implicature with some, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which is that one. So yeah. There, the critical sentence would be Cookie Monster has some of the cookies, right?
Right.
And so you see in the second box, Cookie Monster has some but not all of the cookies. And in the third box, he in fact has all of the cookies, right? So the third box represents the stronger alternative, right?
Yeah.
Or a violation of the implicature, if you want.
Yeah.
And the second box supports the implicature some but not all, right?
Right.
So the meaning strengthened via the implicature.
Right.
Now with numerals, you have exactly the parallel configuration. So when you hear 2 fish, exactly 2 fish is a second box, right?
Yeah.
And 3 fish, which is actually compatible with the weaker meaning of 2 fish, right? So at least 2 fish is compatible with 3 fish. So again, exactly the same trick, exactly the same situation. The third one would represent the violation of the implicature. So the violation of 2 but not more, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that if you prefer the meaning enriched via implicature, then you are predicted to choose a second box. If you don't have any preference, so if you do not derive the implicature, you are predicted to go basically 50-50, right? Because both of these boxes represent a meaning that is compatible with the sentence without the implicature. So Cookie Monster ate some and possibly all. That's fine if he had some but not all. That's fine if he had all. In the box there are at least 2 fish, would be fine with 2 and 3, right? And so the interesting result is that in that particular condition, right? In the sum condition, adults and children have different preferences, right?
Yeah.
So which is the box that the adults prefer?
The adults prefer in the sum condition. They prefer the real sum box they chose before.
Yeah. Can you show the box again? Yeah. That one, right? That one. Whereas the children had no preference. So they chose both boxes 50-50.
Well, there were like 53% that chose the box in which Cookie Monster had some, and 20% in which he had all, and 20 chose the covered box.
Right. But with the numerals, they behave the same. So they all chose the box with 2 fish, right?
All chose the box.
Yeah.
Well, all in this case, all chose the box with 2 fish. Yeah.
Yeah. So can we draw some interim conclusions from these results?
Well, we are a bit indecisive. Like, it's not 100% sure yet, but in this case, it strongly indicates that numbers do have exact semantics.
Right. Right.
But there's still this issue here of children being indecisive about the scalar terms.
Uh-huh.
That's why there is experiment 3.
Yes.
Here.
So, please.
Right, yeah.
Thank you.
Where children were again tested, and it was almost the exact same experiment, like they were the same tasks, but now they were asked to give the box in which Cookie Monster has all of the cookies. So like the result is that children do understand the quantifier, like they do make a difference between some and all. And furthermore, concerning the figure before, we can conclude that their interpretation in the number word trials was based on the number word semantics. That's what this experiment says. Like, yeah. And then we can still argue that there are 2 issues with the overall experiments. The first one is that participants could have been influenced by their knowledge of what is inside of the covered box, since they were allowed to look inside it first. And their choices could be influenced by the complexity of the contents of the boxes. Like in one box, you've got Cookie Monster and Big Bird, and this contains 2 sets of stuff shared between 2 characters, and the other task only contains the fish. And this is one simple set. So there was a 4th experiment in which there were 2 changes made. So first, nobody was allowed to see what's inside the covered box at all. And second, the complexity of the materials was increased. So instead of using the fish, they also used the Big Bird and Cookie Monster, just not asking to choose the box in which Cookie Monster had some of the cookies, but in which Cookie Monster had 2 of the cookies. All right, so those are the results of this experiment. In figure A, we see the results of the adults, and in figure B, we see the results of the children. And as you can see, it's almost the same concerning the numbers. Like, still, they well, this is only the figure of the test phase here. So with the sum conditions, the adults were a bit more indecisive than before, but still the majority chose the box in which Cookie Monster had all of the cookies. But almost 100% of the adults chose the covered box when it came to Cookie Monster having 2 of the cookies. And children did almost the same. So what can we conclude? First of all, we found out that 2- to 3-year-olds interpret numbers as referring to an exact quantity. Like adults, they rejected salient lower bounded targets and aimed for the covered box. On the lower bounded theory, the rejection of a lower bounded target can only be explained as an effect of an upward bounding scalar implicature. However, 2 features of our current results make such an explanation quite unlikely. First, scalar implicatures are motivated by the knowledge of the terms on the scale. So now we got those 2 knowers. So our children preferred the exact interpretation of 2 without even knowing the meaning of 3. And second, the interpretations of number words was obviously in contrast with the interpretations of the scalar terms, as our experiments showed before, like here. So the final conclusion of the paper is that now we've got some good reason to believe that number words do have exact semantics. However, I'm still not 100% concerned. Like, those findings do represent number word meanings out of context, but what about contextually bound numbers? Like in spontaneous speech, okay, numbers might have exact semantics, but thinking about it, they are somehow scalar terms, in my opinion. Like if I say a dog has 3 legs, it's technically not wrong. It's just weird to hear. And furthermore, numbers can be used as scalar terms, thinking of utterances like, there are 100 options of what we could eat today. And I don't mean that there are exactly 100 options, but there is just a really large number of options and I can't decide. So my personal conclusion is something like, in many cases, numbers do have exact semantics, I agree, but there surely are some in which they don't. But what do you think about this?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, it's a good open question. So I just want to ask you something. There is something that I did not understand because I did not remember the last experiment. Mm-hmm. So what did I do in the experiment 4?
Well,
what was the scenario of the experiment 4?
Wait a minute, I will
remember that.
Right. So the problem with the experiments before was that the children and adults were allowed to look inside the covered box.
Okay. So it was just the same experiment without being allowed to look into the covered box.
Right, yeah. Right? It was just that there were those 2 issues, like the covered box issue and the one that the task with Cookie Monster is a bit more complicated, a bit more complex than the task with the fish. Like one containing 2 sets split between 2 characters and one just containing 1 simple set.
Okay, but the results you are showing about, are they referring to the critical condition where, for instance, Cookie Monster and Big Bird, where Cookie Monster had all of the objects, right?
Yeah.
So this is the implicature violation condition.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are the adults.
These are the adults, right? And those are the children.
And these are the children. So in the number condition, they always went for the cover box, right?
Yeah.
And in the scalar condition, here the adults accepted the all in 60% of time, right? So we still have a difference between adults and children, because children were always fine with all, right?
Yeah.
But still, if the choice of the cover box is our index of implicature computation, here the adults only derive the implicature in 30% of time, right?
Yeah.
Which is super low, which is like a super low rate of scalar implicature computation on SAM. If we compare this to the Bliket experiment, where even children had like 90% of scalar computation rate, right?
And still, it's funny because like children just agreed with it, and adults were not so sure here, where they were more sure on this side. Like there were only like 10% that didn't agree with the sum for all term.
Right. So then again, one more example that tells you how the absolute rate of scalar implicature computation is dependent on a lot of different factors, especially the kind of task, and even whether you allow people to look into the cover box or not, right?
Yeah.
as for your last point, that it still seems that numbers have. Oh yeah, sorry. First of all, is there any comment, any question from our audience? Does anyone have anything to ask or to say about this? Any comment? Any thought? Okay, so what I wanted to say is that, so what you said basically is that it seems that in some contexts numbers do behave as scalar items, right?
Yeah.
So you know, in few words, you know, one of the issue about adopting a theory according to which numerals are exact is that you still have to find a way to derive the at least interpretation, right?
Yeah. Because
we know that we do have the at least interpretation, and sometimes we can have it. Like, for instance, you know, can you lend me 2 bikes for this weekend? And then if you say, of course, yes. Do you have 2 bikes? Yes, of course, I do have 2 bikes. I have 5, right?
Yeah.
So in this kind of answer, by saying that you have 2 bikes, and then you know, adding more information and saying that you have 5 bikes, forces you to interpret the 2 as at least 2. So we have this interpretation, but then how does that come about? How is that derived, right? And some people propose different ways to derive the at least interpretation, like by adding, for instance, some existential closure operator to the sentence. So to say I have at least 2 bikes would be something to say there is a set of exactly 2 bikes. There is at least a set of exactly 2 bikes in the group of bikes that I own. In fact, I own 5, and with these 5 bikes, you can find a lot of subsets that actually have a cardinality 2, right? So this would be one way. The other way would be to say that, for instance, numerals are lexically exact, but then when you compose to for instance, the predicate of the sentence, right? Like, you know, in I ate 2 ice creams, you say, okay, 2 ice cream is exactly 2 ice creams. But then when I compose 2 ice cream with the verb eating, then you have a sort of existential predication over some events of eating. So then you say there is at least one event in which I ate exactly 2 ice creams. But then again, when you add an existential quantifier, you add something that is logically weak and that is compatible with the existence of an event in which you ate 3 of them, or in another event in which you ate 2 of them. And then if you sum together these 2 events, at the end of the day, you ate 4 ice creams, right? So yeah, there are a lot of issues about this. But yeah, so that's something that has to be taken into account, especially when we talk about other phenomena that might interplay with numbers interpretation, like, for instance, scope ambiguity, right? Okay. Any other comments or questions about these presentations? Okay. So there was one thing that I wanted to say now that we talked about numerals, about the experiment that we discussed on scope ambiguity of numerals. Okay. And you remember when I tried to write stuff on the blackboard, on the whiteboard, right? And I was talking about this how, now that we know a little bit more about the numeral interpretation, how these different meanings that can be assigned to numerals, for instance, may interact your scope configuration and also with scenarios that you use to test scope configuration, right? So if you remember, the example was something like I don't know, the boy didn't eat 2 pizzas, right? And so the narrow scope interpretation of numerals would be the boy didn't eat 2 pizzas, he only ate 1. Whereas the wide scope would be, or the inverse scope would be, there is a set of 2 pizzas that the boy didn't eat, right? So in the visual scenario, you would have a group of 2 pizzas that were not eaten, and then a group of 2 pizzas that were eaten. You remember this? Okay. So what I wanted to say, now that we know a little bit about implicatures and numbers, what I wanted to say is that specifically in the context of that experiment, these kind of implicatures can have different effects. So if you remember, so let's take the numerals wide scope example, okay? So let's assume that the sentence, the boy didn't eat 2 pizzas, is interpreted with the numeral scoping out. So in a way, like, there is a set of 2 pizzas that the boy didn't eat, okay? Now, this kind of interpretation, first of all, it's completely compatible with the specific reading, okay? So by saying that, for instance, there is a salient set of 2 pizzas, let's say 2 margaritas, right, that I brought, and I'm referring to that specific set, and the boy hasn't eaten them, okay? But then again, what I want to say is that it doesn't really matter whether you compute the implicature on these 2 pizzas or not. So it doesn't matter whether it is an exact set of 2 pizzas or whether it's an at least predication of 2 pizzas. So it could be 3 pizzas, 4 pizzas, 5 pizzas that the boy hasn't eaten, right? Because in that context, where there is a set of 2 pizzas that the boy didn't eat, both these interpretations would be true. You see what I'm saying? That whether there is a specific set of 2 pizzas that I have in mind that the boys didn't eat, or whether this is interpreted in more in logical terms. So let's say, you know, it might be a 3 for 100 pizzas that the boy didn't eat, right? All these interpretations are true in a context where there are 2 pizzas that the boy didn't eat and 2 pizzas that the boy ate, okay? Now, let's move to their context for the narrow scope interpretation, which was the boy didn't eat 2 pizzas, he only ate 1, okay? Now, in this specific context, it matters how you interpret the numeral. So for instance, if you have a specific interpretation of the numeral, so again, if you're saying, for instance, the set of 2 pizzas that I'm referring about is the 2 pizzas that I brought to the dinner, okay? And now I'm telling you that the boy didn't eat those 2 specific pizzas that I brought. Now you see that the narrow scope of numerals with respect to negation has exactly the same interpretation as the inverse scope of the numerals of the interpretation of numerals in this respect, okay? So you're always saying, take a specific set of pizzas, I didn't eat that, the boy didn't eat that set, okay? So there are 2 pizzas that the boy didn't eat, no matter whether you move the numeral out of the scope of negation or you leave it in situ within the scope of negation, okay? Now, this is not the interpretation that was favored by the experimental setup. The interpretation that was favored was the not 2, but just 1, okay? So in order to get this interpretation, what you can do actually is to derive a so-called indirect implicature. So you do not interpret the numeral as exactly 2, right? You leave it unbounded, so you leave it as it means 2 or more. So there would be the boy did not eat 2 pizzas or more, right? And then you can have a stronger alternative where you substitute the numeral 2 with a higher numeral. So there is a set of at least 3 pizzas that the boys didn't eat. There is a set of 4 pizzas that the boy didn't eat. Okay, and then you're left with these two meanings. So one is there is a set of 2 pizzas or more than the boy didn't eat, and the other one is there is a set of 3 pizzas or more than the boy didn't eat. Now, guess what? The one with the higher numeral is logically stronger, because if you haven't eaten 3 or more pizza, it follows that you haven't eaten 2 or more pizzas. Okay, is that right? No, it's the other way around. Right. Yeah. So, sorry, that was actually wrong. The stronger alternative is the one with the smaller numeral. Okay. So if there is a set of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 pizzas that you are sure you haven't eaten, that is stronger than, I don't know, a set of 3 or 4 or 5, or a set of 4 or 5 or 6. Okay. So what is stronger than a set of 2 pizzas that you haven't eaten is a set of 1 pizzas or more that you haven't eaten. Okay. So if you say there is a set of at least 2 pizzas that I haven't eaten, right? Then you have your stronger alternative that would be that there is a set of 1 pizza or more, basically any pizza, right? This is stronger, and then if it enters in the scalar computation, as we know, from the pragmatic Ricean reasoning, then you can, if there is something stronger that you could have said but you didn't say, then it should be negated pragmatically, right? Because you didn't have enough evidence to say that. Therefore, you, at the end of the day, you get with the meaning, there is a set of 2 or more pizzas that I haven't eaten, but it's not true that I didn't eat any pizza at all, which suggests that you ate 1, okay? So in very, very simple terms, in this case, not 2 is compatible with 1. I didn't eat 2 pizzas, I only ate 1, right? And this was the context that Litz and Musolino used in their experiment, where they were testing for the narrow scope. But see that it's not just the scope configuration that matters, it is also the pragmatic operation that come into play in order to shape the meaning of numerals. Okay, so just to make you an example, if we assume that numerals are always exact, okay, and you leave the numerals in situ, you leave the numeral with narrow scope with respect to negation, and you assume that negation takes scope on this exact meaning, what that would mean is that there is not a set of exactly 2 pizzas that I ate, which is open with the possibility that I ate any other set of numerosity that does not correspond to 2. Okay? So this is just to say that you have to be very careful when you make assumptions about what kind of operations come into play when interpreting quantifiers and numerals with respect of their scope. And I think, and actually, this can be logically proven, that in Litz and Musolino experiment, they were kind of cheating a little bit. So they were assuming that every time that the numerals would be in the narrow scope, that there is unproblematically this indirect implicature taking place, and when the numeral takes wide scope, then you might have a normal scalar implicature that tells you that the numeral has exact numerosity. Okay, so the cheating part is that they assumed an exact meaning what the numeral scopes out, but the non-exact meaning what the numeral stays in narrow scope, okay? And I mean, that is a reasonable assumption, but you have to spell it out. So you have to say why things behave like this, okay? And yeah, and you know, if you're interested into this, I might tell you something about this, about why, you know, it is often the case that when numerals occur in certain contexts, they do not have actually an exact interpretation, okay? Especially under negation, in conditional, and this kind of context. Okay, so we are late. Sorry about this. Thanks a lot for the presentations. They were really good. And we meet tomorrow at 11 again, okay? And tomorrow we are going to have just one presentation about a nice study with the neuroscience methodology by Shitridge. So we are going to talk about something very, very fancy. And then I will probably tell you something about a study that we did, okay? So have a nice day. Thank you very much. And see you tomorrow.